The Ancient City, Book 3, Chapter 6, The Gods of the City. We must not lose sight of the fact that, among the ancients, what formed the bond of every society was a worship. Just as a domestic altar held the members of the family grouped around it, so the city was the collective group of those who had the same protecting deities, and who performed the religious ceremony at the same altar. This city altar was enclosed within a building, which the Greeks called Prytaneum, and which the Romans called Temple of Vesta. There was nothing more sacred within the city than this altar on which the sacred fire was always maintained. This great veneration, it is true, became weakened in Greece at a very early date, because the Greek imagination allowed itself to be turned aside by more splendid temples, richer legends, and more beautiful statues. But it never became enfeebled at Rome. The Romans never abandoned the conviction that the destiny of the city was connected with this fire which represented their gods. The respect which they had for their vestals proves the importance of their priesthood. If a consul met one of them, he ordered his fasces to be lowered before her. On the other hand, if one of them allowed the fire to go out, or sullied the worship by failing in her duty of chastity, the city, which then believed itself threatened with the loss of its gods, took vengeance upon her by burying her alive. One day the Temple of Vesta came near being burned in a conflagration of the surrounding houses. Rome was in consternation, for it felt all its future to be in peril. When the danger had passed, the Senate instructed the consul to search out the authors of the fire, and the consul made accusations against several inhabitants of Capua, who happened at that time to be in Rome. This was not because he had any proof against them, but he reasoned in this manner. A conflagration has threatened the hearth of our city. This conflagration, which might have destroyed our grandeur and stopped our progress, could have been started only by the hands of our most cruel enemies. Now, we have no more determined enemies than the inhabitants of Capua, this city which is now the ally of Hannibal, and which aspires to take our place as the capital of Italy. These, therefore, are the men who have attempted to destroy our Temple of Vesta, our eternal fire, this gauge and guarantee of our future grandeur. Thus, a consul, under the influence of his religious ideas, believed that the enemies of Rome could find no surer means of conquering it than by destroying its sacred hearth. Here we see the belief of the ancients. The public fire was the sanctuary of the city, the cause of its being and its constant preserver. Just as the worship of the domestic hearth was secret, and the family alone had the right to take part in it, so the worship of the public fire was concealed from strangers. No one, unless he were a citizen, could take part at a sacrifice. Even the look of a stranger sullied the religious act. Every city had gods who belonged to it alone. These gods were generally of the same nature as those of the primitive religion of families. They were called lares, penates, genii, demons, heroes. Under all these names were human souls deified, for we have seen that in the Indo-European race, man had at first worshipped the invisible and immortal power which he felt in himself. These genii, or heroes, were, more generally, the ancestors of the people. The bodies were buried either in the city itself or upon its territory. And as, according to the belief which we have already described, the soul did not quit the body, it followed that these divine dead were attached to the soil where their bodies were buried. From their graves they watched over the city, they protected the country, and were, in some sort, its chiefs and masters. This expression of chiefs of the country, applied to the dead, is found in an oracle addressed by the Pythia to Solon. Honor with a worship the chiefs of the country, the dead who live under the earth. These notions came from the very great power which the ancient generations attributed to the human soul after death. Every man who had rendered a great service to the city, from the one who had founded it to the one who had given it a victory, or had improved its laws, became a god for that city. It was not even necessary for one to have been a great man or a benefactor. It was enough to have struck the imagination of his contemporaries, and to have rendered himself the subject of a popular tradition, to become a hero. That is to say, one of the powerful dead, whose protection was to be desired, and whose anger was to be feared. The Thebans continued during 10 centuries to offer sacrifices to Eteocles and Polynices. The inhabitants of Acanthus worshipped a Persian who had died among them during the expedition of Xerxes. Hippolytus was venerated as a god at Troezene. Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, was a god at Delphi only because he died and was buried there. Crotona worshipped a hero for the sole reason that during his life he had been the handsomest man in the city. Athens adored, as one of its protectors, Eurystheus, though he was an Argive. But Euripides explains the origin of this worship when he brings Eurystheus upon the stage, about to die, and makes him say to the Athenians, "Bury me in Attica. I will be propitious to you, and in the bosom of the ground I will be for your country a protecting guest." The entire tragedy of Oedipus Coloneus rests upon this belief. Athens and Thebes contend over the body of a man who is about to die, and who will become a god. It was a great piece of good fortune for a city to possess the bodies of men of some mark. Mantinea spoke with pride of the bones of Arcas, Thebes of those of Geryon, Messina of those of Aristomenes. To procure these precious relics, ruse was sometimes resorted to. Herodotus relates by what unfair means the Spartans carried off the bones of Orestes. These bones, it is true, to which the soul of a hero was attached, gave the Spartans a victory immediately. As soon as Athens had acquired power, the first use she made of it was to seize upon the bones of Theseus, who had been buried on the Isle of Skyros, and to build a temple for them in the city, in order to increase the number of her protecting deities. Besides these gods and heroes, men had gods of another species, like Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, towards whom the aspect of nature had directed their thoughts. But we have seen that these creations of human intelligence had for a long time the character of domestic or local divinities. At first men did not conceive of these gods as watching over the whole human race. They believed that each one of them belonged in particular to a family or a city. Thus it was customary for each city, without counting its heroes, to have a Jupiter, a Minerva, or some other divinity which it had associated with its first Penates and its sacred fire. Thus there were in Greece and in Italy a multitude of city-guarding divinities. Each city had its gods, who lived within its walls. The names of many of these divinities are forgotten. It is by chance that there have remained the names of the god Satrapes, who belonged to the city of Elis, of the goddess Dindymene of Thebes, and Soterea of Aegium, of Britomartis in Crete, of Hyblaea at Hybla. The names of Zeus, Athena, Hera, Jupiter, Minerva, and Neptune are better known to us, and we know that they were often applied to these city-guarding divinities. But because two cities happened to apply the same name to their god, we are not to conclude that they adored the same god. There was an Athena at Athens, and there was one at Sparta, but they were two goddesses. A great number of cities had a Jupiter as a city-protecting divinity. There were as many Jupiters as there were cities. In the legend of the Trojan War, we see a Pallas who fights for the Greeks, and there is among the Trojans another Pallas who receives their worship and protects her worshippers. Would anyone say that it was the same divinity who figured in both armies? Certainly not, for the ancients did not attribute the gift of ubiquity to their gods. The cities of Argos and Samos had each a Hera Polias, but it was not the same goddess, for she was represented in the two cities with very different attributes. There was at Rome a Juno. At a distance of 5 leagues, the city of Veii had another. So little were they the same divinity that we see the dictator Camillus, while besieging Veii, address himself to the Juno of the enemy, to induce her to abandon the Etruscan city and pass into his camp. When he is master of the city, he takes the statue, well persuaded that he gains possession of the goddess at the same time, and devoutly transports it to Rome. From that time, Rome had 2 protecting Junos. There is a similar history a few years later of a Jupiter that another dictator took from Praeneste, though at that time Rome already had 3 or 4 of them at home. The city which possessed a divinity of its own did not wish strangers to be protected by it, or to adore it. More commonly, a temple was accessible only to citizens. The Argives alone had the right to enter the temple of Hera at Argos. To enter that of Athena at Athens, one had to be an Athenian. The Romans who adored 2 Junos at home could not enter the temple of a 3rd Juno, who was in the little city of Lanuvium. We should not lose sight of the fact that the ancients never represented God to themselves as a unique being exercising his action upon the universe. Each of their innumerable gods had his little domain. To one a family belonged, to another a tribe, to a third a city. Such was the world which sufficed for the providence of each of them. As to the God of the human race, a few philosophers had an idea of him. The mysteries of Eleusis might have afforded a glimpse of him to the most intelligent of the initiated. But the vulgar never believed in such a God. For ages man understood the divine being only as a force which protected him personally, and every man, or every group of men, desired to have a god. Even today, among the descendants of those Greeks, we see rude peasants pray to the saints with fervor, while it is doubtful if they have the idea of a god. Each one of them wishes to have, among these saints, a particular protector, a special providence. At Naples, each quarter of the city has its Madonna. The Lazzaroni kneel before that on their own street, while they insult that of the neighboring street. It is not rare to see 2 Facini wrangle and even fight with knives in defense of the merits of their respective Madonnas. These cases are exceptions today, and are found only among certain peoples and in certain classes. They were the rule among the ancients. Each city had its corps of priests, who depended upon no foreign authority. Between the priests of 2 cities there was no bond, no communication, no exchange of instruction or of rites. If one passed from one city to another, he found other gods, other dogmas, other ceremonies. The ancients had books of liturgies, but those of one city did not resemble those of another. Every city had its collection of prayers and practices, which were kept very secret. It would have thought itself in danger of compromising its religion and its destiny by opening this collection to strangers. Thus, religion was entirely local, entirely civic, taking this word in the ancient sense, that is to say, special to each city. Generally, a man knew only the gods of his own city, and honored and respected them alone. Each one could say what, in a tragedy of Aeschylus, a stranger said to the Argives, "I fear not the gods of your country, I owe them nothing." Every city looked to its gods for safety. Men invoked them in danger and thanked them in victory. Often, defeat was attributed to them, and they were reproached for having badly fulfilled their duty as defenders of the city. Men even went so far sometimes as to overturn their altars and stone their temples. Ordinarily, these gods took good care of the city whose worship they received, and this was quite natural. These gods were eager for offerings, and they received victims only from their own city. If they wished the continuation of the sacrifices and hecatombs, it was very necessary that they should watch over the city's safety. See in Virgil how Juno strove and labored that her Carthage might one day obtain the empire of the world. Each of these gods, like the Juno of Virgil, had the grandeur of his city at heart. These gods had the same interests as the citizens themselves, and in times of war marched to battle in the midst of them. In Euripides we see a personage who says, on the eve of battle, "The gods who fight with us are more powerful than those who are on the side of the enemy." The Aegintians never commenced a campaign without carrying with them the statues of their national heroes, the Acidae. The Spartans in all their expeditions carried with them the Tindaridae. In the combat, the gods and the citizens mutually sustained each other, and if they conquered, it was because all had done their duty. If a city was conquered, the gods were supposed to have been vanquished with it. If a city was taken, its gods themselves were captives. On this last point, it is true, opinions were uncertain and diverse. many were persuaded that a city never could be taken so long as its gods remained in it. When Aeneas sees the Greeks, masters of Troy, he cries that the gods have departed, deserting their temples and their altars. In Aeschylus, the chorus of Thebans expresses the same belief when, at the approach of the enemy, it implores the gods not to abandon the city. According to this opinion, in order to take a city, it was necessary to make the gods leave it. For this purpose, the Romans employed a certain formula which they had in their rituals, and which Macrobius has preserved. O thou great one, who hast this city under thy protection, I pray thee, I adore thee, I ask of thee as a favor, to abandon this city and this people, to quit these temples, these sacred places, and having separated thyself from them, to come to Rome, to me and mine. May our city, our temples, and our sacred places be more agreeable and more dear to thee. Take us under thy protection. If thou doest this, I will found a temple in thine honor. Now the ancients were convinced that there were formulas so efficacious and powerful that, if one pronounced them exactly and without changing a single word, the god could not resist the request of men. The god thus called upon passed over therefore to the side of the enemy, and the city was taken. In Greece we find the same opinions and similar customs. Even in the time of Thucydides, when the Greeks besieged a city, they never failed to address an invocation to its gods that they might permit it to be taken. Often, instead of employing a formula to attract the god, the Greeks preferred to carry off its statue by stealth. Everybody knows the legend of Ulysses carrying off the palace of the Trojans. At another time, the Aeginetans, wishing to make war upon Epidaurus, commenced by carrying off 2 protecting statues of that city and transported them to their own city. Herodotus relates that the Athenians wished to make war upon the Aeginetans, but the enterprise was hazardous, for Aegina had a protecting hero of great power and of singular fidelity. This was Aeacus. The Athenians, after having studied the matter over, put off the execution of their design for 30 years. At the same time, they built in their own country a chapel to this same Aeacus, and devoted a worship to him. They were persuaded that if this worship was continued without interruption during 30 years, the god would belong no longer to the Aeginetans, but to themselves. Indeed, it seemed to them that a god could not accept fat victims for so long a time without placing himself under obligations to those who had offered them. Aeacus, therefore, would in the end be forced to abandon the interests of the Aeginetans and to give the victory to the Athenians. Here is another case from Plutarch. Solon desired that Athens might become mistress of the little isle of Salamis, which then belonged to the Megarians. He consulted the oracle. The oracle answered, "If you wish to conquer the isle, you must first gain the favor of the heroes who protect it and who inhabit it." Solon obeyed. In the name of Athens, he offered sacrifices to the 2 principal heroes of Salamis. These heroes did not resist the gifts that were offered them, but went over to the Athenian side, and the isle, deprived of protectors, was conquered. In time of war, if the besiegers sought to gain possession of the divinities of the city, the besieged, on their part, did their best to retain them. Sometimes they bound the god with chains to prevent him from deserting. At other times, they concealed him from all eyes, that the enemy might not find him. Or, still again, they opposed to the formula by which the enemy attempted to bribe the god another formula which had the power to retain him. The Romans had imagined a means which seemed to them to be surer. They kept secret the name of the principal and the most powerful of their protecting gods. They thought that, as the enemy could never call this god by his name, he would never abandon their side, and that their city would never be taken. We see by this what a singular idea the ancients had of the gods. It was a long time before they conceived the divinity as a supreme power. Every family had its domestic religion, every city had its national religion. A city was like a little church, all complete, which had its gods, its dogmas, and its worship. These beliefs appear very crude to us, but they were those of the most intellectual people of ancient times, and have exercised upon this people and upon the Romans so important an influence that the greater part of their laws, of their institutions, and of their history is from this source.